10 days ago, the Astran ambassador stood before our esteemed cosmic assembly, urgently pleading for intervention to prevent a brewing conflict. A catastrophe awaits, she said, but how did we respond? Laughter, derision, and outright dismissal. We mocked their concern, and while the assembly disregarded the threat, the Astran had every right to seek a peaceful resolution. Had our exploration probes not stumbled upon their distant outpost, it might have taken centuries before we encountered them. Despite our warnings to the Dominion of Varn to cease their territorial ambitions and forego the planned invasion of Astran space, our pleas were ignored. Some members of this assembly empathized with the Astran, yet due to the immense power of the Dominion, you remained silent. You may have already noticed the grand chair to my right, usually occupied by the Dominion's representative, remains empty. Word has it that he has fled to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, a fate both swift and predictable, considering the tragic events that followed. 9 days ago, under orders from this assembly, I journeyed to the Astran system nearest to Dominion-controlled territory. What awaited us there was beyond imagination. We, like many in this chamber, believed the Astran were a fledgling civilization, technologically inferior, and militarily incapable of defending themselves. It was assumed that if they had a fleet at all, it would be a ragtag collection of obsolete ships. Senators, we could not have been more mistaken. As our command frigate approached their defenses, we were confronted by the sight of an immense fleet. 12 capital warships formed the vanguard, while the flagship, an imposing fortress the size of a moon, was flanked by hundreds of supporting vessels. The scale and complexity of their armada were unimaginable. We were granted an audience aboard the Astran flagship, where we were greeted by Grand Admiral Morland Sidar. He led us through their command center to meet a familiar face, Selena Sidar, the Astran ambassador, and as it turned out, their chief strategist. Selena thanked me for the respectful words I had offered after her impassioned appeal to our assembly. She then wasted no time in revealing the intricacies of their battle strategy. With swift precision, she and her father laid out their plans to repel the Dominion forces. Their confidence was unshakable, and for good reason. Hours later, my diplomatic team and I returned to our ships, deeply troubled by what we had learned. As we prepared for much-needed rest, a blinding flash in the distance captured our attention. A newly constructed Astran warship had just completed its assembly, and for the first time its reactor roared to life. I've seen many shipyards in my time, but watching the birth of such a massive warship was breathtaking. Before I could fully comprehend the sight, a shock wave rippled through the fleet. Turning toward the source of the disturbance, I witnessed something beyond belief. A massive asteroid had materialized within the Astran flagship's grasp, drawn through a glowing portal. Drones swarmed the asteroid in seconds, tearing it apart for raw materials. My officers and I stood there, utterly awestruck, as we observed the astonishing efficiency with which the Astran repurposed the rock. An hour later, the asteroid had been reduced to nothing but space dust. Returning to my quarters, I wrestled with what I had just witnessed. For centuries, this assembly has prided itself on its technological superiority, our control over the known galaxy, and our domination in warfare. And yet here was a civilization, barely 800 years old, whose capabilities dwarfed anything we had ever encountered. The most astonishing part: they had once been primitive, warlike, even using atomic weapons on themselves in their distant past. Yet now, their empire possessed technologies we could only dream of. Senators, we gravely underestimated them at every turn. Their diplomatic gestures, which we so casually dismissed, had been offered in good faith, not as a sign of weakness. Shortly before the Astran Empire launched their counter-offensive against the Dominion of Varn, they broadcast a speech to their people, which we recorded. It was a solemn declaration of war. Citizens of the Astran Coalition, 1 year ago we discovered we were not alone in the cosmos. We rejoiced, celebrating the discovery of other civilizations. We traded knowledge, extended peaceful gestures, and opened our borders to limited exploration. But one faction, the Dominion of Varn, grew envious of our progress. They harassed our borders, arrested our traders, and destroyed one of our fledgling colonies. In an effort to prevent war, we sent my daughter, Ambassador Selena, to plead for peace before the assembly. They laughed at her and ridiculed our overtures for peace. But today the Dominion will learn the price of their arrogance. Today we go to war for the coalition. As the Grand Admiral concluded his address, the Estren fleet prepared for the final stage of their campaign. What happened next was nothing short of remarkable. The Estren opened a massive gateway, large enough to transport their entire fleet to the Dominion's outer system in mere hours. Senators, what we thought would be a protracted, bloody conflict was over before it had even begun. When the Dominion forces opened fire, we expected the Estren to suffer significant losses in the initial barrage, but the Estren had devised a system unlike anything we'd ever seen. Their capital warships created an energy field that shielded their entire fleet, absorbing the brunt of the attack with little consequence. What followed was a relentless assault. Waves of Estren fighters and bombers launched from their carriers, accompanied by missile barrages and artillery fire. The Dominion's once formidable fleet was picked apart with terrifying precision. By the time the Dominion's front line had been breached, their forces were already crippled. The battle lasted less than an hour, leaving the Dominion reeling from the overwhelming onslaught. And then came the flagship's ultimate weapon, a gravitational beam aimed at the nearby moon. In mere moments, the surface of the moon glowed with an intense red light before erupting into molten fragments. A portion of the debris hurtled toward the Estren flagship, and we feared disaster. But, with astounding mastery of portal technology, the Estren redirected the debris through a wormhole, ejecting it far from harm. The sight left us speechless. By the time the battle ended, the Dominion fleet had been annihilated. Their colonies fell within days. The Estren swiftly established blockades, cutting off supply lines and isolating Dominion strongholds. It took the Estren Empire a mere 5 days to achieve what would have taken any other power years. Their military strategy was unmatched. After crushing the Dominion's outer defenses, they advanced on the Dominion's homeworld. Once the final bastions of resistance crumbled, the Dominion surrendered unconditionally, marking the end of their once mighty empire. On the 7th day of the conflict, the Estren attempted to negotiate a peace settlement, sending a single ship to meet with the surviving Dominion leaders. However, the Dominion's treachery knew no bounds. They offered a gift of peace, a bomb, hidden aboard the ship. The ship exploded upon its return to the Estren fleet, killing all aboard. This final betrayal sealed the Dominion's fate. In response, the Estren launched their final assault, positioning their fleet in a flawless formation across the galactic plane. The flagship took position high above the Dominion's homeworld, overseeing the destruction. With surgical precision, the Estren forces eliminated the remaining military infrastructure, targeting fortified moons, space stations, and the remnants of the Dominion fleet. The gravitational beam once again came into play, this time obliterating the Dominion's most fortified moon in a spectacular display of power. After several hours of relentless assault, the Dominion of Varn had been utterly defeated, and their empire lay in ruins. In the aftermath of the conflict, the Estren executed the remaining leadership of the Dominion, dismantled their military infrastructure, and installed their own regional governors to oversee the transition. The once proud Dominion, now a shadow of its former self, was reduced to a vassal state. Senators, I have seen countless wars in my lifetime, but never one as swift, decisive, and overwhelming as the one waged by the Estren coalition. Their speed, strategy, and technological prowess are beyond anything we have ever encountered. Let this be a lesson to us all: we must never again provoke the Estren coalition. Their power is not to be trifled with, and their capacity for war is unlike anything the galaxy has seen before. It is clear now that we severely underestimated them, and that mistake nearly cost us everything. Senators, I urge you to remember this day, for it may very well mark the turning point in the history of our galaxy. In the wake of the Estren victory, the galaxy entered a period of stunned silence. The Dominion of Varn had been one of the most powerful empires within our reach, and yet they were dismantled in less than 9 days by a civilization most of us had barely heard of. The Estren coalition had not just won a war, they had demonstrated a level of power and precision that was utterly unmatched. Across the galaxy, many of our allies and even our rivals began to reassess their positions, wondering how they would fare if faced with the full might of the Estren. For centuries, the Dominion of Varn had been considered one of the greatest military forces, and now, reduced to a fraction of their former strength, they could no longer pose a threat to anyone. The Estren, on the other hand, were now emerging as a dominant force and empire that seemed not only capable of surviving in this vast galaxy but of thriving and expanding far beyond what we had imagined. The Estren had taken control of 70% of the mineral output from former Dominion systems and seized the outer colonies, incorporating them into their empire. This move wasn't just a sign of victory, it was a signal to the galaxy that they intended to maintain a long-term presence. Those of us in the Assembly who had doubted the Estren's intentions before could no longer deny their strategic brilliance. Their swift subjugation of the Dominion and subsequent control over key resources left many of us wondering what their next move would be. Would they be content with this new territory, or were they laying the groundwork for further expansion? Speculation grew among the political elite of our Assembly, and some began to advocate for establishing deeper diplomatic relations with the Estren. After all, if they could defeat the Dominion in such a short span of time, what hope did we or any other empire have of resisting them if conflict arose? While the Assembly debated and speculated, the Estren remained remarkably quiet. There were no further threats, no shows of aggression, and no immediate signs of further expansion. Instead, they focused on consolidating their gains. Reports from the occupied Dominion world spoke of a surprisingly efficient occupation. The Estren implemented strict but fair governance, allowing the local populations to continue their daily lives with minimal disruption. They rebuilt infrastructure, re-established trade routes, and brought advanced technologies to the once dominant Dominion worlds. It became clear that their goal was not merely to conquer but to integrate and uplift the territories they claimed. This was a surprising turn of events for many of us. The Estren had been depicted as a warlike people, but their actions after the war suggested a far more complex and sophisticated approach to empire building than we had anticipated. In the midst of this transition, rumors began to circulate about the Estren's next move. Some believed that they would turn their attention toward the Galactic Assembly itself, seeking to challenge the long-standing balance of power that had governed our corner of the galaxy for millennia. Others speculated that the Estren would focus on exploration, expanding into the uncharted regions of space, far beyond the reach of the Assembly. Still, there were those who whispered that the Estren had no grand designs on domination, that they were merely defending their borders and solidifying their position. Regardless of the truth, one thing was certain: the Estren coalition had forever altered the galactic landscape. Their rise to power was swift, decisive, and impossible to ignore. For many empires, the question was no longer how to defeat the Estren, but how to coexist with them in a galaxy that now bent to their will. As weeks passed, the Assembly made several attempts to reach out to the Estren for formal diplomatic discussions. These were met with polite but firm refusals. The Estren made it clear that while they were not interested in starting another conflict, they had no desire to join the Assembly or align themselves with any particular faction. They were independent, and they intended to remain so. This neutrality was both reassuring and unnerving. On one hand, it meant that the Estren were not actively seeking to expand their influence through force. On the other, it left the galaxy in a state of uncertainty, as no one could predict what might provoke the Estren into action again. In private, some of the more ambitious senators began to devise plans to either ally with or contain the Estren. However, no consensus could be reached. The memory of the Dominion's swift defeat loomed large, casting a shadow over any potential schemes. The Grand Admiral Morland Sidar, once seen as a mere military leader, had now become a figure of immense respect and fear throughout the galaxy. His tactical genius, combined with the advanced technology of the Estren fleet, had turned him into a living legend. Every empire from the largest to the smallest now studied his strategies, hoping to glean some insight into how he had orchestrated such a rapid and complete victory. Stories circulated about his personal involvement in key battles, his calm demeanor in the face of overwhelming odds, and his unwavering dedication to the Estren people. Selena Sidar, his daughter and chief strategist, was equally admired. Her role as both a diplomat and a military mastermind was a rare combination, one that many found both fascinating and intimidating. Together, they represented a new era of leadership in the galaxy, one defined not by brute force but by calculated precision and overwhelming efficiency. As for the former Dominion of Varn, their leadership had been all but eradicated. The Rolling Council, the governing body that had ruled the Dominion for centuries, was executed in the aftermath of their surrender. The Estren, in a move that surprised many, did not impose harsh punitive measures on the civilian population. Instead, they focused on dismantling the Dominion's military capabilities and integrating the remaining planets into the Estren sphere of influence. Life, for the average citizen of the Dominion, returned to a semblance of normalcy far more quickly than expected. But beneath the surface, the scars of defeat remained. The Dominion was no longer an independent power. Its people now answered to Estren governors, and its resources were funneled into the Estren war machine. The once mighty empire, which had stretched across dozens of star systems, was now little more than a province in the ever-expanding Estren coalition. As I stand before you today, Senators, I urge you to reflect on the events of the past weeks. The speed and precision of the Estren victory should serve as a reminder that no empire is invincible, and no civilization can afford to rest on its laurels. For centuries, we believed ourselves to be the pinnacle of technological and military achievement. We viewed other empires with condescension, certain that our dominance would remain unchallenged. But the Estren have shown us that the galaxy is far larger and more unpredictable than we imagined. In the face of this new reality, we must adapt. We must learn from the mistakes of the Dominion and from the success of the Estren. Whether they become our allies or our adversaries, one thing is clear: the Estren coalition is now a force to be reckoned with. The era of complacency is over, and the future of the galaxy will be shaped by those who can rise to meet this new challenge. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. For every comment that says we will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.